Imagine arriving here, Andersonville, one of the Confederacy's largest prison camps, soon after the end of the Civil War. The prisoners are all gone. Not too much remains in the way of artifacts. A tin cup, a cap, scraps from a shirt, a club, a sea of tents, ragged sheets of canvas flapping in the wind stretched over the Georgia dirt. Imagine that earlier, during the summer of 1864, starving prisoners of war were laying themselves down in this dirt to die. Their fate was determined by forces much larger than themselves. But while the Civil War outside the stockade walls raged on, the daily routine inside was more desperate. Get enough to eat and stay alive.
I have lain on the battlefields, surrounded with dead and dying, and listening to the agonizing cries of the wounded. But it is nothing compared to this den of misery and woe. Unless one was there, it is hard for the mind to grasp the magnitude of this hell on earth.
The Confederacy picked Andersonville for the location of a prisoner of war camp in late 1863 because it was remote from the fighting, but close to a rail line. There was fresh water and plentiful forests that could be used for timber. Construction of Camp Sumter, as Andersonville was officially called, began in January of 1864. By mid-February, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander W. Persons was in command, preparing facilities to accommodate 10,000 men. Enslaved African Americans supplied most of the labor, building a stockade that covered 16.5 acres. A wall made of logs stood 15 feet high, and guards stood at posts 90 to 100 feet apart. Prisoners soon began arriving steadily, before construction of the camp had been completed.
"500 weary men moved along slowly through the double lines of guards. Two massive wooden gates with heavy iron hinges and bolts swung open as we stood there, and we passed through into the space beyond. We were in Andersonville.
From the beginning, Lieutenant Colonel Persons had a hard time securing sufficient building materials, guards, and food. The vast majority of the Confederacy's resources was being channeled to its fighting soldiers, not to Union prisoners of war. No housing had been built for the captured men, who were now arriving at 400 a day. The prisoners were forced to construct their own shelter any way they could, using blankets, coats, or tent flies they had brought with them, along with any brush or scrap wood left in the enclosure. They got their drinking water from Stockade Branch, which cut through the center of the prison. But waste from the bakehouse and guards camp, located directly upstream, contaminated the water before it reached the prisoners. The downstream end served as the prisoners' latrine. Despite these grave planning mistakes and lack of resources, no one could anticipate the place Andersonville would become. As the spring of 1864 wore on, Stockade Branch began to slow.
A narrow, shallow stream, which was very sluggish on account of the small supply of water and the slight descent of the ground, was our only water supply. And when we would go after the water, we would often sink to our hips in the mire. And men would often have to be dragged out by their comrades.
With its shortfalls in supplies and manpower, Confederate authorities needed someone who could enforce discipline. The kind of man that could compensate for Andersonville's lack of guards and resources. Captain Henry Wirtz assumed command of the prisoners on March 27, 1864. Wirtz was a tough 41-year-old captain who was born in Zurich, Switzerland.
Lieutenant Persons is no longer in command of the prison, but instead, a Captain Wirtz came inside today and looked us over. He's not a very prepossessing looking chap. Skin has a pale, white, livered look with thin lips. Has a sneering sort of cast of countenance. He is a brute.
One of Wirtz's first acts was to set up a simple rail fence inside the perimeter of the stockade to prevent any attempt at escape. Beyond this line, prisoners would be shot. It was called the deadline. On April 1st, 1864, the stockade contained 7,160 men. Hundreds more arrived every day.
Then came the captives, weary, worn, and hungry from prolonged travel, cooped up like beasts in freight cars. Now from the depot, they marched amid the jeers and taunts of a gaping crowd. The gate opened. The stockade swallowed them.
Earlier in the war, Southern and Northern forces exchanged prisoners regularly under an arrangement called the Dix Hill Cartel. But the agreement broke down, in part because the North objected to the Southern policy of treating captured African American soldiers differently. Some had been massacred, others were placed into slavery, and many of their white officers had been executed. With no exchange in effect, prison camps in the South and North grew more crowded. By May, there were 24,000 men at Andersonville, more than twice the number it was designed to hold. Without any adequate increase in resources, the prisoners began to die at an alarming rate.
My tent mate, Thomas Tabor, died yesterday. He stubbed his toe against a root some time ago, and being barefooted at the time, caught cold. Bathing in the brook water, which was sure to fester the wound and ultimately to gangrene. All those who came in here wounded are dying of the same thing.
As the chaotic tent city grew more crowded, the lack of designated passageways made it harder for Confederate guards to police the area. Competition for food and space was fierce. It was not long before desperate prisoners formed gangs that roamed the prison yard, terrorizing their fellow soldiers. These gangs became known as the Raiders.
They numbered nearly 200 and were composed of bounty jumpers and natural-born thieves and ruffians. They traveled in bands of 5 to 20 and were armed with sandbag clubs, tough pine clubs, brass knuckles, dirk and bowie knives, and carried pine roots which had sharp points which had been hardened to the consistency of ebony in a slow fire. One blow with this weapon would fracture a man's skull at once.
Discipline at Andersonville slipped even further by June, when most of the prison guards were called up to the battlefront and replaced by untrained Georgia reserves, mostly old men and boys. June turned to July. It was a hot summer, even for Georgia. As the prisoners languished inside the stockade, they struggled to find ways to pass the time.
Give a Yankee a jackknife and he can make almost anything. The rebels found out the most expert whittlers and furnished them materials to work on. And thus, many prisoners earned extra rations in this way.
Incoming prisoners brought news of the war. Newspapers were passed around and read voraciously. Even grooming could be a source of entertainment.
Well, we had to have some kind of amusement, and so they had lice races. They could get a tin plate, make a small ring in the center of the plate, heat it in the sun, drop 2 lice in the center of the plate, and bet on the one getting out of the ring first. I seen poor fellows crawl up to look at the lice race. They'd be dead in 30 minutes.
Money and goods were smuggled into the prison, and meager amounts of food could be purchased for outrageous prices. But they could keep a man alive. Prisoners constantly tried to escape by tunneling to freedom. Most were recaptured.
Just as it was coming light in the east, we heard dogs after us. In a few moments, the hounds came up with us and began smelling us. Pretty soon, 5 mounted rebels arrived on the scene of action. They laughed to think we expected to get away.
For the most part, the prisoners were powerless to ease their abhorrent living conditions. Yet they found the strength to put an end to the raiders' reign of terror. The prisoners formed a police squad called the Regulators. And with the approval of Captain Wirtz and the assistance of Confederate guards, they rounded up and arrested the raiders. On July 11th, 1864, the 6 ringleaders were tried, found guilty of stealing, robbery, and murder, and hanged. As the 2 armies battled each other through July, Southern stores of food were destroyed in raids. The Union Army shattered the Confederate railroad network, paralyzing the transportation of supplies. With more prisoners and fewer resources than ever, conditions at Andersonville were worsening.
Would that I was an artist and had the material to paint this camp in all its horror, or the tongue of some eloquent statesman, and had the privilege of expressing my mind to our honorable rules in Washington. I should glory to describe this hell on earth, where it takes 7 of its occupants to make a shadow.
Captain Wirtz approved the request of the prisoners to send a delegation to Washington with a petition signed by their comrades, pleading that the prisoner exchange program be reinstated.
We earnestly yet respectively pray that some action be taken immediately to effect our speedy release, either on parole or by exchange. The dictates of both humanity and justice alike, demanding it on the part of our government.
The petition was presented in Washington on August 4th, but the Northern government did not change its policy. The prisoners returned to Andersonville and resumed their captivity. Later in the month, Northern General Ulysses S. Grant confirmed that any exchange of prisoners of war remained out of the question. For the first time, he acknowledged another reason to leave the men where they were.
Every man released, on parole or otherwise, becomes an active soldier against us at once, either directly or indirectly. If we commence a system of exchange which liberates all prisoners taken, we will have to fight on until the whole South is exterminated. If we hold those caught, they amount to no more than dead men.
By the beginning of August, the number of prisoners had grown to nearly 33,000, making Andersonville the 5th largest city in the Confederacy. The stockade had been enlarged to encompass 26.5 acres, but this still gave each man not much more than an arm's length of space. Diseases ran rampant. Most common was dysentery with diarrhea. The men also suffered from scurvy, pneumonia, and smallpox.
Some of the cases of sickness which have been witnessed during the last few days are horrible in the extreme. One man who lies near our tent was found to have the lower part of the body eaten into holes by maggots. He's been washed by some of the men in his detachment, but can hardly recover. Near him lies one who, although weak from diarrhea, is still able in a measure to help himself, but having lost all ambition, has given up hope and desires only to be left alone to die in his filth.
There are millions and millions of all kinds of vermin here. Flies, bugs, maggots, lice. Some of them as large as spiders. Once they get the best of you, you're a goner. A great many of the prisoners are hopelessly crazy, starvation, disease, and vermin being the cause. I am somewhat crippled myself, but I managed to try and wash and keep clean. That is the principal thing. 100 have died within the last 24 hours.
Wagons, which brought food to the stockade in the morning, brought out bodies in the afternoon. The guards lacked the manpower to dig individual graves, and so prisoners were forced to bury the dead in trenches.
Here comes the government wagon, piled full of our brave boys, thrown like a lot of dead swine, to be rudely thrown out again on their arrival at the burial ground.
Stockade Branch had become a swamp of filth. The men, desperate for fresh water, used spoons and broken canteens to dig over 200 wells, some as deep as 55 feet. Then, in mid-August, a heavy rainstorm hit Andersonville. Many later said that a bolt of lightning hit the ground just inside the deadline. For some, this was divine intervention. But for all, it was an answer to their prayers.
A spring of purest crystal water shot up into the air in a column and, falling in a fan-like spray, went babbling down the grade into the noxious brook. Looking across the deadline, we beheld with wondering eyes and grateful hearts the fountain spring.
Union armies began marching through Georgia in the fall of 1864. When General Sherman's cavalry came within striking distance of Andersonville, most of the prisoners were relocated to other camps. After the threat passed, some men were returned to the stockade during the winter. The last few remaining prisoners were freed from Andersonville during the first week of May 1865, as the Civil War ended.
Today came an order from General Daney for us to be paroled and sent north. Bully, may we soon see our sweethearts? Hope 'tis true.
The Union forces that arrived at Andersonville found that only numbered stakes marked the prisoners' graves. When accounts of Andersonville reached the north, cries for revenge were sounded. Captain Wirtz was arrested and put on trial for war crimes, even though over 230 prison guards also died at Andersonville, and conditions at northern prisoner of war camps had not been much better.
I met Wirtz while on one of his inside visits. He stopped his horse, and I explained to him briefly the situation and condition of my comrades. This was the substance of his reply. I am doing all I can. I am hampered and pressed for rations. I am blamed by the prisoners for all this suffering. They do not or will not realize that I am a subordinate governed by orders of my commanding officer. Why, sir, my own men are short on rations. The best I can do is see that your sick comrades are removed to a hospital. God help you. I cannot.
Captain Wirtz was found guilty and hanged in Washington, D.C. He was the only man held responsible for Andersonville. During the summer of 1865, a former prisoner, Dorrance Atwater, returned to Andersonville. He had worked in the hospital and had secretly made a copy of the list of dead prisoners. Atwater was accompanied by a woman who would go on to found the American Red Cross, Clara Barton. Together they matched his list with the numbered stakes. Allowing each of the dead to be honored by name. Of the 45,000 Union soldiers who passed through the gates of Andersonville, nearly 13,000 died. Union and Confederate governments locked in combat. Did not devote resources for the prisoners of the war. Something had gone terribly wrong. These men, caught in a system that had broken down, paid the price.